We're very aware of other intersecting factors, and that broader concept of intersectionality and diversity is really important. What I would say is that gender remains the number one most consistent structural driver of inequality.
So far in this series, we've looked at academia, advocacy and architecture, the 3 A's in the housing policy space. Outside of government, there are a couple more areas where we can find people trying to make change. The big one is philanthropy and impact investment. It's where organisations are injecting funds into innovative pilot projects and programs that help us scale up gender-responsive housing. Philanthropy often brings the startup funds, taking on the risk of these projects, while impact investors have the bigger pots of money which bring growth. Without organisations like these, many housing projects would remain on the drawing board. I'm Dr. Kate Raynor, the Director of the Centre for Equitable Housing at Per Capita, and I have been researching Australian housing for over a decade. What could a gender-equal housing system look like? How would we know it if we saw it? That's what we'll find out in Season 2 of Homes Not Houses. On this week's Homes Not Houses, we'll take a close look at the role of philanthropy and impact investment with Julie Reilly OAM, the CEO of Australians Investing in Women. With diverse experiences in government, corporate, not-for-profit, university, media, and of course philanthropy, Julie shared her expertise with us.
Thank you so much for your time, Julie. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I wanted to start with a more, a personal question, which is about your own relationship with housing, homelessness, and gender. And just wondering how you came to be working in this area.
Well, thanks, Kate, for having me. It's a pleasure to work with you and Per Capita. Look, I've got a very personal relationship with housing, homelessness and gender, and the issues stemming from my start in life, really. They're themes that have been pretty major drivers that have shaped both my personal and professional life. I'm the youngest of 4 girls, all very close in age, and when I was about 1 year old, my mother left the family home in an extremely violent marriage with 4 children, 5 and under. So that sort of blows my mind when I think about it. And that was through necessity. I would dare to say, had she not left, we would not be here. So it has been something that shaped my life very profoundly, from the get-go. And, without going too much into detail, it's not an uncommon story. In order to get away, she had to pretend that she was staying with her parents for a brief holiday. So she had very little by way of clothing or equipment or anything for us. And it was well before there were any women's refuges. There weren't even legitimate welfare payments for single mothers then. I think there was, if you were a war widow, you got something. And so the main safety net in those days were actually faith-based institutions. And for all of the many, many failings of the Catholic Church, they were our saviour in many ways. They provided us with somewhere to live for the first 5 or 6 years.
Wow. I mean, it's such a poignant reflection on the importance of those service systems. And it's hard to reflect on the decisions that your mum would have had to have made if that was not available to her. So thank you for sharing that. I think that kind of leads to the next question I have, which is, what does gender have to do with housing? And you've touched on a part of that. But yeah, from your perspective, do you think people of different genders have different needs and different capacities to access housing?
Yes, and again, I think, our family was a bit of a case study in that. To the extent that gender shapes your income, your caring responsibilities, whether you're safe or not, what assets you've got access to, they all influence housing and housing security. Obviously, in those days, particularly as a single mum, the opportunity to earn an income, let alone a sort of decent wage, was just not there. And so those kind of things, when we think about what gender has to do with housing, it's so fundamental. As we know, it's the very foundation of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We absolutely have to have shelter and safety. And because domestic violence is such a big factor in driving homelessness and housing need, and because gender-based violence is so disproportionately affecting women, to not think about gender even just in that slice of the issue is just madness, really. You're not going to get good solutions if you haven't looked at that analysis properly.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see it in the statistics and the discussion about the fact that a woman will on average leave her violent perpetrator 7 times before she actually makes it out of the house. And there are a range of structural barriers to that, including a lack of safe and affordable and appropriate housing, amongst other things. So yes, fundamentally, those concepts are intertwined. And I think that conversation, it makes a lot of sense in the conversations that we're having to think about from a gender lens. But I know in the conversations that we've had with the broader sector and with different actors, sometimes what we hear is that, yes, it's good to talk about gender, but gender is only one component within a broader framing of intersectionality. And should we be talking more broadly about diversity? Is gender a distraction, or is gender kind of pointing our direction in the wrong way? Given what your career is focused on, I think I know what you're going to say, but I'm interested in your take on that.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. And I think it is a really important question, because we're not suggesting for a minute that it's the only lens. We're very aware of other intersecting factors, and that broader concept of intersectionality and diversity is really important. What I would say is that gender remains the number one most consistent structural driver of inequality for reasons we've talked about. It's across income, wealth accumulation, safety. And if we don't name it and we don't actually call it out, we'll miss those sort of specific patterns that are shaping housing experiences for women. So a gender lens doesn't replace intersectionality, it actually strengthens it. And I often say, yes, we need to talk about and look at things like age and disability, culture and geography, and diverse gender identity. We need to look at all of those things. But there are 2 what I would call foundational lenses, gender being one of them. We all experience life in a particular way due to our gender and the way society has structured those concepts of gender. And the other is climate, actually. And even though the geography will determine how dramatically or otherwise climate and climate change is affecting us, we all live on this planet. They're the 2 things that really affect us all. And then for some parts of the population, they experience other forms of disadvantage. And so, yes, diversity, intersectionality, absolutely important. But gender, for me and for many, many researchers and those looking at evidence, would say it's the dominant feature.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And of course, there are many ways in which experience of climate and climate change is gendered. So we could layer those things and go down a fascinating rabbit hole there as well. But I'm wondering, does this discussion of gender land when you're talking to philanthropics, when you're talking to impact investors? Yeah, do you think that these kinds of actors are thinking about gender at the moment?
So I would say that they are thinking about it much more than they used to, and that's really because of the existence of our organisation. And it was actually the fundamental reason that Jill Reichstein and Eve Marlab set this organisation up as what was then Australian Women Donors Network. It was because it wasn't formally and commonly a feature of philanthropic decisions and conversations. So I think it does land. I think over a decade and a half of that kind of advocacy has definitely changed the conversation. When it comes to impact investors, I'm less familiar and less confident, because that's probably that's a new area for us. We have traditionally looked at the flow of private capital as philanthropy. And in our last strategy that we launched last year, we have expanded that into actually looking at capital flows full stop. And impact investing is really key to that. And I think they have a very different criteria. You and I have had some conversations with impact investors, and I think definitely financial metrics are much more dominant than, even though the social output and the social equation is important. So in short, it's definitely much more on the agenda in philanthropy. It's definitely landed more strongly. We've got a lot of work to do in impact investing and beyond, but it's why this roadmap, Kate, that you're developing is so important, because that will be a key tool to help us drive that advocacy.
Yeah, it's such an interesting reflection about the different drivers between impact investors and philanthropic organisations. And I had a really interesting conversation with Kath Leon on this podcast. And her argument was, Kath comes from a background in banking, now working in an organisation that does impact measurement. And her argument was, look, impact investors have a fiduciary duty. They need to hit a certain financial return, and we can show them what that financial return is. We can also use quantitative research and figures to explain how there might be social benefit to investing from a gender lens perspective. But do we necessarily need to quantify the financial outcomes of that gender component, or do we just kind of prosecute this argument from a social perspective? And there's like a real tension there. So it's fascinating to think about what can and what should be quantified when we argue about these things, or when we advocate, rather, I should say, on these things.
And Kate, I think that there's different appetites depending on the groups of people that you're speaking with. There are some very progressive, very well-informed, very experienced brains that I think do think about gender and impact investing very clearly. Obviously, the financial metrics matter, but to your point, they are not. If you're really looking for social impact, you have to be looking at more than just the dollars. Absolutely. And look, I think that traditional notion that philanthropy is there to take, it's the risk capital of society, it's there to invest in ideas that governments or markets might not yet be ready for. The idea would then be that impact investors can work with them in partnership to help scale those sort of solutions and direct capital towards housing that delivers both social and financial returns. That's the whole thesis, as we know. And part of our work and the work with you has been on how do we strengthen those connections between philanthropy and impact investing, between philanthropy and government, and between philanthropy, government, impact investing, and the community housing providers who are really close to the coalface and in touch with lived experience.
One of my questions was going to be, what is the role of philanthropy in this ecosystem around housing and gender? And one thing you're saying is the role of philanthropy is around that risk-taking component. Are there other things that philanthropy does really well in that world that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and increasingly I've seen the power of this. They're very good at funding research and advocacy and really understanding that there are multiple levels at which they can make a contribution, but to change the big picture and to change the system, you have to have the data and the evidence. You have to have a voice that's influencing policy. That philanthropic dollars of themselves are not going to ever be a solution. So philanthropy certainly has a role also in that immediate crisis support and intervention when people literally don't have anywhere to live or anything to eat. But increasingly strategic philanthropy is looking to solve the problem rather than to just be dealing with the consequences of the problem. And there's a classic narrative I'm sure you've heard about whether you choose to use your money to be the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff or to build that fence at the top of the cliff. And look, in reality, we have to do a bit of both. But increasingly, I think the bigger bets are on the real systems levers and changing policy and coming up with innovation that actually produces a different result. And certainly in that early per capita research that Emma led, there were different sorts of solutions that can be very effective for older women, and we know that cohort are particularly likely to be experiencing housing stress and homelessness because of a lifetime of disadvantage. But yes, I would say philanthropy, what we would like to do is build that connective tissue between the philanthropic funders and impact investors and government and providers. That's part of what this work is all about.
Yeah, and I love your reflection on the movement of money away from the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff and towards the fence at the top. And so many of the discussions we're having on this podcast and in the world generally is how much better for the individual to avoid that crisis moment of homelessness. How much better for the household, for the family, for the children, for society in general. And we have this housing system that puts women round and round circles of crisis accommodation. And it's frustrating to think about both the lived experience of that and the system wastefulness of it.
And Kate, and to your point, the flow-on economic and social costs of that, the sort of disengagement often from schooling, from education, from work, from a whole lot of systems that then create this flow-on effect of really huge social issues. So those critical issues of providing safe and affordable housing, and I think I've said this many times, we believe all Australians, irrespective of their gender, men, women, people of diverse gender identity, all have a right and an entitlement to safe, affordable housing. It is just that if you're looking at this massive problem that Australia is facing into and you don't segment your market and you don't really analyse and understand the need and the drivers, it's not a gender-neutral issue, and a gender-neutral solution is not going to address the problem in the most impactful way.
Thank you. That's such a compelling argument for why we don't do gender-neutral thinking in this project, because it's perpetuating an existing system and the existing system is not gender equal. So, yes. My question to you is that you and I have been traveling around Australia together for the last year. It's been so fun, thank you, speaking to people about the importance of embedding a gender lens in housing funding. And I'm interested what surprised you most about those discussions.
Yes, and look, it has been really informative, and it's always good, I think, for people who work somewhat at a distance from the issues that we're trying to impact to really speak to people close up. So that of itself has been incredibly valuable, and to meet these really passionate, intelligent people who really care deeply about this has been really rewarding. I think to your question of what's been surprising, there's been a few things. So I would say I have been well aware, as many, many people are, of the growing scale of the housing crisis. But on the first level, digging into that per capita analysis of the crisis and the drivers, even before we got to the gendered analysis, was really powerful, looking at the unintended consequences of things like the capital gains tax concessions, looking at the inequity that is being driven when we see housing not as a home for a family or a home for a person, but as a wealth creation tool. But, these are things that I think are in the national narrative quite a bit. But when you're really deeply embedded in that discussion, it is just actually quite shocking to me that we've got to this point and that we have had decades of underinvestment in social housing by multiple governments of different persuasions. And it just blows my mind, to be honest, when I look at that data, that this was just a train wreck really waiting to happen. And so I'm shocked and puzzled that we've allowed things as a country to get to this point. And I guess I see both personally and dispassionately that home ownership, or the ability or inability to access home ownership, becomes the driver of your economic stability virtually for the rest of your life. It's what's sort of driving this inequality gap. And I have two daughters who are in that demographic of wanting to be homeowners, one who's managed to get into the housing market and the other one not yet. And I despair for the generation, to be honest. And it drives me even more strongly to try and get some effective solutions that help people get into housing, and not just home ownership, but just to stable, safe and affordable housing.
Yeah, it's really bold at that point, isn't it? That's a very basic thing. Just access to stable, affordable housing. Then there's an increasing proportion of the population for whom that is impossible or is wildly challenging, and it's always been a challenge for people within certain parts of society, particularly people with multiple forms of disadvantage, but it's increasingly spreading to other sectors of society, and I think that's what's getting us talking about it more. It's also wildly concerning.
Yeah, and Kate, on that, perhaps if I could go to the more positive side of what surprised me, and I started to reference it, is just how quickly people do see the connection once you show the data and explain the issue. There is a real willingness and an openness and a recognition of why gender does matter once you present that. So I think that's always very encouraging. And the other thing that, I won't say it's been surprising, but it's been very affirming, is just the quality of responses we've received, the passion and commitment of the people that recognise those housing patterns, and that they work closely enough to really understand at a very, very visceral level why this matters. So that's probably been the positive side of just how affirming it is to see people and the appetite they have to have their solutions and actions and asks or requests, particularly of connection to government and philanthropy, and their willingness and eagerness to have those things heard.
And I mean, people just don't know what they don't know. That once you can articulate it, then there becomes the opportunity for learning. I was reflecting and asking these questions. What has surprised me is that I think about housing and gender all the time. All the time. In my home, in my workplace, all the time. And I'm still hearing things that I've never thought of before. I had this conversation with someone about the justice system and women, and they were talking about the fact that women end up in jail from minor drug offences far more frequently than men. And it's because women are more likely to be picked up for possession or for small amounts of drugs or any form of substance. And men are more likely to be picked up for distribution or slightly more serious crimes. And because of this, the men are more likely to have legal representation, like free legal representation through the system. And so the women have got a lower crime, but are more likely to end up in jail because the system has distributed. And if you're not thinking from a gender lens, then it makes sense, right? You would give the free legal support to those who are more likely to be in greater amounts of trouble in the legal system. But it's accidentally, I would presume, penalising women. And I'm like, how have I never thought of this? If you don't know, how could you have that thought?
No, and I think in some ways the beauty and the burden of this is that once you see things through a gender lens, you see everything through that lens and you can't unsee it. And one of the great delights of working in partnership with groups like the Champions of Change Coalition and talking to CEOs who've been members of that organisation and have had the benefit of research and education and conversations, will say to me, I cannot not see these issues now. They're there. And, certainly Doug Hilton, who was on our board in the medical context, is acutely aware of things like that. So it's our challenge, Kate, is how you get those sort of gender lens glasses firmly on the noses of people who are moving capital around for housing. And, that is our great hope and our great opportunity, I think, with this work.
Well, I think you've just answered the next question I was going to ask you, which is, as we've discussed, we're putting together a roadmap at the moment about gender lensing housing policy and housing funding in Australia. And we've got different areas that we're interested in within that. One of them is about building buy-in. One is about understanding need and nuance and data. Another is about training and capacity. And the last one is about embedding a gender lens thinking within existing systems, like institutionalizing a gender lens. And I'm wondering what parts of that puzzle Australians investing in women are most focused on.
We're definitely most focused on the gender lens. I think once you embed that understanding, providing people with practical tools and checklists and frameworks that they can refer to, ensuring that there's always the prompt for gender to be on the agenda. I think once you start to think like that, it becomes a way of seeing all of the other issues, and it becomes, sort of back to our earlier point, it just becomes something you're much more conscious of. If I think about our founders, and certainly Eve Marlab was very famous for this, she would simply, in a board meeting or a board discussion, every single item or recommendation or expenditure, she would ask very simply, well, what will be the impact on women if we do this, or how will that impact women? So I think having that process and demonstrating why that question matters is where our focus is. And Kate, you've heard me say before that traditionally we've been quite issue agnostic. It's about trying to get that mindset and that understanding and present data and evidence through a gender lens. But when it came to the work that Per Capita did on housing and the subsequent work that you've done in actually activating that into an action roadmap, we just could see with so many social issues that housing was central to solving, well, not solving all of them, because some of them, gender-based violence and preventing violence is such a pervasive problem and a real need. But when it comes to economic security, employment, health, education, parenting, all of these issues, if you don't have that housing challenge solved, particularly if you're a single mother with children, you're just going to be behind the eight ball, and those kids will bear the brunt of that as well. So the part that we're focused on is that sort of thinking and solution in embedding that, and using housing actually as a bit of a demonstration model so that we can help people understand that, yes, this is how a gender lens applies to these questions, and therefore it's also important in the arts, in health, in medical research, in political representation, etc. So we'd like to think that that we have influence on all of those levels, but our primary aim is to embed that thinking into the minds of people who are making decisions about capital allocation, be that philanthropic, impact investing, or in fact government housing.
Yeah, and I think that's the most effective way to make change, right, is teaching that way of thinking, embedding that way of applying it in a range of different decision-making processes. So, yeah.
And Kate, what I would say is, we're very lucky in many ways. This federal government has made it very clear that budget decisions require a gender analysis or a gender impact statement of some sort before the money is allocated to any major project. And similarly in Victoria, if not in other states, we've got a Gender Equality Commissioner, and there are actually regulatory obligations around considering gender. What I think is the gap that we've really identified is you might get that at one level. It might be in the initial allocation of funding or at a particular level of the decision-making tree, but unless you're embedding that in the whole process, it's really not going to have the effect that you want it to have.
Which is a nice segue to, if you could ask anything of the federal government, what would you be asking them for?
Well, I think we have got, in some ways, money. We've got billions of dollars in many ways allocated to addressing this issue. We would implore the federal government to really embed that gender lens obligation and support. So it's a bit like if you think about where we were on climate 20 years ago or 30 years ago. If you required an environmental impact assessment, there was a whole market. There is now a whole market of people who can help you do that with a project. We need to build a skills base and a service industry that can support people to do that gender analysis. People who work in community housing and in women's housing know it inside out, but we don't actually have a lot of funding or resourcing. It's one of my dreams, I guess, that would come out of this, is that we can actually foster a specialist gender impact advisory service. It certainly exists out there, but there's not a lot of professional expertise available to people. So that would be one thing I would really encourage the federal government to look at. But I think it's really about a longer-term commitment rather than just a once-off funding a particular women's housing development. And I think we find this in philanthropy a lot, and it's not intentional, but people will say, oh, okay, you're raising the question of gender and women with me. Yes, we've funded a women's project or we've funded a women's. But if you actually get them to do the analysis of how equitable their giving is across the board, it really surprises them often in philanthropy that when they do the analysis, there might be several women projects that talk about women, but there's small amounts of money that don't add up to a great deal when compared to the overall distribution. So, sorry, I know you were asking me more about government. What would I ask of them? I would ask that they mandate in the same way that environmental analysis and requirements are there, that we really mandate gender lens considerations.
That's a great ask. And speaking of someone who has been employed in environmental impact assessment of the social components within it, I can absolutely see that there is whole university degrees and whole consulting firms and like whole systems built around ensuring that environmental impact is looked after and everything that's flown on from that. So absolutely, I see that. And I also take your point that when organisations look at whether they've addressed the challenges of women, it's one project. And to take it to the federal government perspective, I think we go, oh, they've put a lot of funding into crisis accommodation. And absolutely that's gendered, because by far and away the main users of crisis accommodation are women. But if you're not looking at a gender lens across your entire housing portfolio, then we're just going, oh, we've ticked that box, we've thought about women. But is crisis accommodation the only thing that we need to be considering in this system? Absolutely not. So it needs to be broad scale across everything.
And I think that circles back to our need for people not to see it as a barrier or another thing to get through, but actually a way that they will have a better solution. It informs a better outcome. And so there is that sort of education and advocacy piece that has to go with it.
Yes. Absolutely. So I have 2 questions for the end of this conversation, and I ask everyone because it's just a fun way of doing it. First one is this vibing and venting. And so my question is, what is one thing that you're vibing or excited about within gender and housing? And what is something that you need to vent about?
Okay, so a few things I'm vibing about. I would say, firstly, it is this report, and that we will bring together, more than 150 people that we've consulted in really specialist roles, whose ideas and needs and suggestions for action will be captured. So that's getting close, Kate, and that's very exciting. I think the other thing is that having moved into gender lens investing as an organisation, there is just a whole new opportunity for influence with impact investing and the broader capital markets. And so that really excites me. In terms of the specifics of this project, again, I would say I'm vibing on that growing recognition that housing systems need to work for a diversity of people, not just a single model of households. I certainly recall in one of our discussions, people talked about this need to get high volume, low cost housing out, and they're producing masses of, 1-bedroom apartments that in no way meet the needs of a woman escaping domestic violence with children to accommodate. So that's both a vibe and event, I'm going to say. But I think what I'd probably vent about is how gender is still often seen as a niche issue. I think we come up against this expectation or belief, and we've had a lot of insights into this through the Gender Compass work that Plan International Australia has led with Rebecca Huntley. I think there is a view that we have done so much in Australia that gender equality is kind of almost a ticked box. And I might say that's not a common view amongst women, but there is actually so often a view that really after all this time, after all this work, really aren't we there yet? And I think that's something that I really, really struggle with, that people, despite all of the data, despite the evidence persist in this view that actually we've made so much progress, we don't need to think about women's needs anymore, and that is just fundamentally not the case. I think the other thing I would say, I don't want to do too much venting.
It's all right. Therapy, let it out.
Yeah, I think it probably might. It could be both a positive and a negative, but I think the state of the world at the moment, watching the pushback on women's rights and gender equality globally, I feel actually quite proud of Australia. I think we are holding our ground, and I think that generally people do not conform to the views that are moving so far to the right when it comes to women's rights around the world. But the state of the world and this decades of work that the women's movement has made to get to a certain point, to see that in other countries stripped back is just absolutely distressing and harmful. And if I could say to turn that around and really implore people to think about that in Australia, that it's not a given that because we've made progress we can't slip back. So this thinking about gender, and at the point I would really want to make with this is that it's not just about improving the lives of women. All of the evidence will say that when women are more equal, when a gender lens approach is taken, it actually benefits everyone. And I will go back to a piece of research that we invested in, and housing was certainly part of this consideration, but it was looking a lot at workplaces. And Deloitte Access Economics had estimated that Australia loses $128 billion every year and could create another 461,000 jobs annually if we did away with rigid gender norms. And to do away with rigid gender norms, you need your gender lens glasses on, and you need to have that mindset and that thinking. So if people are not persuaded by the moral or the social or the ethical issue, the economic argument's just overwhelming.
Yeah, that's such a compelling figure and such compelling research. And we talked to Eleanor Rees on this podcast as well, who does a lot of work on the undervaluation of women's labour. And part of her argument is how interesting that when a woman provides care in the house, it's not considered in the GDP. It's not valued labour. But as soon as you pay an NDIS support worker, or it becomes labour that happens in the formal workforce, then suddenly we can put a figure on it. Like, it's not like the work didn't exist and now magically it appears. It's just we've handed it to someone whose labour we don't ascribe a value to.
And centuries of accepting that is how the world is, without recognising that in contemporary society there is absolutely very few households that can survive with one person in the workforce, very few families. And so, yes, that frustration that we've made many things equal for women in terms of responsibilities, but we haven't taken anything really off their plate.
Yes. My final question is, if you could describe a genuinely gender equitable housing future, what would it look like? And how would we know it if we saw it?
Well, I think we would see all Australians housed, not just women, but we would, because, we haven't talked about this, but visibility is a key issue, and we often think of homelessness affecting men much more dramatically because we tend to see them on the streets. Women's homelessness as an issue tends to be less visible. So what would we see? We wouldn't see people living on the streets, whether they be men or women. But a gender equitable housing system would be far fewer women experiencing the sort of housing insecurity across their lifetime that we see now. And that system, that picture would need to be built on equal pay, less industry segregation that determines pay levels, violence prevention, shared care. It would really be upending so many ways that we operate that need to be interconnected and changed in order for the whole problem to be solved or the whole solution to be found. We'd also see a a big improvement in better data guiding investment and planning. And, you know, you and I have had some pretty powerful conversations around the situation facing First Nations women when it comes to housing. And so often in our research, finding data around First Nations women in different parts of our data sets is really problematic. So we'd have better data, and ultimately we'd know we'd achieved that sort of housing when it works as well for women and gender diverse people as it does for men at every stage of life.
That's a great summary. Thank you so much. And such a good reminder that it's not housing on its own, right? It's housing that exists within multiple systems of labour and caregiving and urban planning, and all of the things come together to increase or decrease gender inequality. So it's a good note to end on. Thank you so much.
That is my pleasure. And I think one of the things we haven't done a lot of today is we haven't thrown a lot of statistics around, because in some ways we see these statistics all the time. So maybe we can point people to some of those at the end of this podcast. But thank you so much for the work that you do, the passion that you bring to it, and the careful rigour and analysis that you also bring to your work. I've loved working with you.
Next time on Homes Not Houses, I'll be chatting with Acting Managing Director at CSNet, Catherine Leong, to take a closer look at the financial side of housing. This series is a production of Per Capita, the independent progressive think tank dedicated to fighting inequality in Australia. We work to build a new vision for Australia based on fairness, shared prosperity, community, and social justice, and we are committed to providing ad-free and editorially independent content. This season is proudly sponsored by the YWCA and Australians Investing in Women, whose support helped produce the show and our research. Homes Not Houses was produced on the lands of the Wurundjeri-Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to the elders past and present.